Tonight, the question is not whether the United States wants a war with Venezuela. The question is why the machinery of war keeps moving even when no one is brave enough to admit they are pushing the button. Because here is the contradiction we are living inside. Washington insists this is about deterrence, stability, and democratic values while simultaneously surrounding Venezuela with warships, surveillance aircraft, special operations deployments, and sanction regimes that collapse civilian life faster than any bomb ever could. If this is not preparation for conflict, then why does it look exactly like preparation for conflict? And more importantly, who benefits if the line between pressure and war finally disappears? For months now, quietly, deliberately, and with remarkable consistency, the United States military posture in the Caribbean basin has shifted. Not rhetorically, not hypothetically, physically. Naval deployments have increased. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance flights have multiplied. Joint exercises with regional partners have intensified, expanded in scope, and moved closer to Venezuelan territorial proximity. These are not symbolic gestures. In military planning, proximity is intent, and intent is never accidental. What we are witnessing is not a sudden crisis. It is the visible surface of a strategy that has been maturing for years, one built on the assumption that Venezuela's government would collapse under pressure, and that collapse could be managed, shaped, or exploited. That assumption failed. And now the strategy is mutating into something more dangerous. This matters because when strategies fail quietly, they are revised quietly. But when they fail publicly, they are often replaced with force. Let's be very precise about the timeline here. Since the mid to late 2010, U.S. policy toward Venezuela has relied heavily on maximum pressure, sanctions targeting oil exports, financial systems, state institutions, and senior leadership. The stated objective was democratic restoration. The operational assumption was economic strangulation leading to political fracture. That fracture never arrived. Instead, the Venezuelan state adapted. Oil flows rerouted. Sanctions were evaded through shadow shipping networks. Security services consolidated power. External partners, Russia, Iran, China, filled gaps left by Western disengagement. What was supposed to be isolation became insulation. From a military perspective, this is a strategic failure. Not because the United States lacked power, but because power was applied under a flawed theory of change. And when a theory of change collapses, militaries do not retreat. They recalibrate. Here is where the military news becomes essential. Over the past year, U.S. Southern Command has expanded operational readiness activities across the Caribbean. This includes naval patrols justified as counter-narcotics missions, aerial reconnaissance framed as regional security monitoring, and multinational exercises designed to improve interoperability in contested maritime environments. Each activity has a plausible explanation. Together, they form a pattern. In military analysis, patterns matter more than press releases. Consider the geography. Venezuela sits astride critical Caribbean sea lanes, adjacent to major energy transit routes, and near U.S. allies whose political stability is treated as a national security interest. Any disruption, whether internal collapse, external intervention, or regional spillover, would trigger immediate U.S. involvement. This has been true for decades. What is new is the framing. The Pentagon is not talking about invasion. It is talking about readiness. It is not naming Venezuela as a target. It is naming threats, organized crime, malign influence, regional instability that just happen to map perfectly onto Venezuela's borders. This is not coincidence. This is strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity allows escalation without accountability. It allows force posture without declaration. It allows preparation without political debate. And it is politically useful because it shifts responsibility away from elected officials and into the realm of necessary military prudence. But military prudence without political clarity is how wars begin by accident. Now, to be absolutely clear, there is no public evidence of an imminent U.S. invasion of Venezuela. Any claim to the contrary would be speculative, and speculation should never substitute for facts. What is factual is this: the United States is positioning itself for a scenario it claims it does not want. That is the tension at the heart of this moment. Military planners do not build options unless leadership believes those options may be needed. And options are expensive. They require logistics, coordination, political signaling, and sustained presence. None of this happens casually, which brings us to the first reveal. The reveal is not that America is planning a war. The reveal is that America has failed to produce a non-military solution and has not admitted that failure. Every sanction regime, every diplomatic isolation effort, every recognition gambit that bypassed internal political realities has narrowed the path forward. When diplomacy collapses and sanctions stagnate, militaries become the default tool not because they are preferred, but because they are available. This is how policy failure becomes military risk. And this is where the democracy versus authoritarianism framing becomes dangerously simplistic. Because framing Venezuela solely as an authoritarian problem obscures a more uncomfortable truth, U.S. policy has treated Venezuelan society as a pressure point rather than a population. Economic pain was expected to translate into political change. It did not. Instead, it hardened authoritarian control while hollowing civilian resilience. That is not democratic leverage. That is strategic miscalculation. And now, with military assets moving closer, exercises growing larger, and rhetoric tightening, even as official language remains cautious, we are left with a fundamental question that no one in power wants to answer out loud. If pressure failed and diplomacy stalled, what exactly is the endgame? Because the military does not deploy for questions. It deploys for contingencies. And in segment 2, we are going to examine the power games beneath this posture, the regional players, the external rivals, and the quiet ways Venezuela has been transformed from a policy problem into a strategic chess piece in a much larger confrontation. If segment 1 exposed the military posture, segment 2 exposes the motive architecture beneath it. Because wars do not begin with tanks. They begin with incentives. They begin when powerful actors stop seeing a country as a place where people live and start seeing it as a space where leverage can be exercised. That is what has happened to Venezuela. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but methodically. To understand this, we have to step outside the narrow U.S.-Venezuela frame and widen the lens to the global power environment in which this confrontation is unfolding. Because Venezuela is no longer being treated as a standalone crisis. It has been absorbed into a larger contest, one defined by declining American tolerance for strategic unpredictability and rising anxiety about influence erosion in the Western Hemisphere. This is not about ideology in the abstract. It is about control over energy flows, over regional alignment, over the credibility of U.S. dominance in its near abroad. And this is where the story becomes far more unsettling. For decades, U.S. strategic doctrine has treated the Western Hemisphere as a stability zone, an area where rival powers should not gain meaningful military or intelligence footholds. This is not controversial. It is foundational. It is embedded in defense planning, alliance structures, and threat assessments. Venezuela has broken that assumption. Through arms purchases, intelligence cooperation, and security partnerships, Caracas has cultivated relationships with U.S. adversaries that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Russian military advisors, Iranian technology transfers, Chinese economic entrenchment. Each relationship alone might be manageable. Together, they represent a direct challenge to long-standing U.S. strategic comfort. From Washington's perspective, this is not merely defiance, it is contagion risk. The fear is not that Venezuela will project power outward. The fear is that Venezuela will normalize defiance inward, demonstrating that a sanctioned, isolated government can survive, adapt, and even bargain from a position of resilience. That lesson is dangerous. Because if Venezuela can do it, others can follow. This is where military news reporting becomes critical again. U.S. defense officials increasingly frame Caribbean operations in terms of countering malign influence. That phrase is deliberately vague. It allows Venezuela to be discussed without being named, and rivals to be confronted without escalation thresholds being crossed. But vagueness is not neutrality. It is a shield. Behind that language is a growing recognition that sanctions alone did not prevent strategic penetration. In fact, they may have accelerated it. By cutting Venezuela off from Western systems, U.S. policy pushed Caracas toward alternative networks that were already eager to exploit the opening. This is not conjecture. This is a pattern observed repeatedly in sanctioned states. And here is the second reveal. U.S. military pressure is not just about Venezuela's government. It is about reversing geopolitical embarrassment, because influence, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to regain without force. Now let's talk about the regional dimension, the part that rarely makes headlines but drives operational decisions. Neighboring countries are watching closely. Some cooperate with U.S. exercises, others hedge. All calculate risk. None want to become the terrain on which a larger confrontation unfolds. And yet, their airspace, ports, and intelligence infrastructure are increasingly integrated into U.S. contingency planning. This creates a silent dynamic. Regional states are being positioned as logistical nodes without being given political agency. That is destabilizing. Why? Because when local governments are seen as facilitators rather than decision makers, domestic legitimacy erodes. Populations begin to suspect that sovereignty is conditioned. That resentment does not disappear, it accumulates. From a military standpoint, this creates fragility. From a political standpoint, it creates blowback. And yet, the posture continues. Why? Because U.S. credibility is now entangled with Venezuela in a way policymakers did not anticipate. Walking away would signal acceptance of strategic defeat, doubling down risks entrapment. This is the classic great power dilemma, but with a smaller state caught in the middle. Here is where speculation must be clearly labeled and carefully constrained. Speculative analysis. Some defense analysts argue that Venezuela is being quietly positioned as a pressure valve, a place where U.S. resolve can be demonstrated without triggering direct confrontation with peer adversaries elsewhere. Not a war objective, but a credibility demonstration. If that is true, the danger is immense. Because credibility demonstrations have a historical tendency to spiral. They rely on controlled escalation. And controlled escalation depends on mutual restraint, something authoritarian systems under pressure are not structurally designed to provide. Which brings us to Venezuela's internal military calculus. The Venezuelan armed forces are not passive observers. They are regime pillars. They are economically embedded. They are politically incentivized to frame U.S. posture as existential threat. That framing justifies internal repression, loyalty enforcement, and resource consolidation. In other words, U.S. military pressure strengthens the very structures it claims to oppose. This is not irony, it is tragedy. The more visible the external threat, the easier it becomes to silence dissent. The more imminent the danger appears, the more acceptable extraordinary measures become. This is how authoritarian systems convert pressure into legitimacy by redefining survival as patriotism. And now another reveal emerges. There is no shared understanding of escalation boundaries. The United States believes it can signal strength without triggering war. Venezuela believes any signal is preparation for regime change. Those interpretations are not compatible. They exist on different threat registers. That mismatch is how miscalculations occur. Not because anyone wants war, but because everyone believes the other side will blink first. And here is the deeper pattern, one that should alarm anyone who cares about democratic accountability. Military activity has surged. Strategic rhetoric has intensified. But public debate has narrowed. Congress is largely silent. The American public is distracted. Policy is being executed through momentum rather than mandate. That is not how democracies are supposed to function. When force becomes routine, scrutiny disappears. When deployments become normalized, consent evaporates. And when conflicts are framed as technical necessities rather than political choices, responsibility dissolves. Which leads us directly into segment 3. Because the final piece of this story is not about Venezuela. It is about the cost of strategic denial, about what happens when powerful systems refuse to admit error and instead push forward until reality intervenes. In the final segment, we will confront the consequences, human, regional, and institutional, and ask the question no one in Washington seems willing to answer. If this path ends in disaster, who will be held accountable?
Golf free break.
Hey,
There's an assault team.
We got the right side. Let's go.
Come out to your position.
Move it. Contact back! Go, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up! This way, this way! Hey, go, grab everything, let's go. Yeah. Shit, you want to take it? All right. We're good, right? Just stay right!
Spin around. Here, 200 around.
Sergeant! Tunnel! What?